Runestones are so much more than just a cool carving on a rock. Hi everyone, welcome back. My name is David, I am a third-year student of Scandinavian Studies, and I like to talk about everything Viking-related, queer-related, sometimes in combination, sometimes apart. And I noticed I haven't made a video about runestones specifically, which I don't know why, because I personally love runestones, and I thought it would be fun to make a little list of things that people are able to learn by looking at the many aspects of a runestone. But before I get into it, it might be helpful to provide a definition of what a runestone is. So a runestone is typically defined as a raised stone with a runic inscription. They are usually associated with early medieval, late Iron Age Scandinavia, and anyone who sees runestones as just a nice stone with a nice inscription, that's already enough, that's already enough. But there's so much more to them, and this is what I want to talk about today. So let's go through 10 things that people can learn from runestones. And number one is, who are the people that made them? And of course, this can be interpreted in two ways. One, the group that these people belong to, for example, the specific time periods that these runestones were carved in, but also individuals, because a lot of runestones have a formula that says this person carved this stone. So not only do we learn something about the general group of people during the Viking Age who raised them, but also specific individuals that commissioned and carved these runestones. So when it comes to people, we arrive at number two, personal names, because many of the stones contain both the person that commissioned the stone, the person that is being commemorated on this stone, and sometimes also the rune carver, because it is not always the same person who commissioned the stone and actually write the runes. So based on that, the stone could have like from one to multiple names on it. And these names are important not only when it comes to tracing the history of those names, because a lot of these, like Thorstein, Torbjörn, Gunhild, Ingrid, are still used in modern Scandinavia, but also because these names contain elements that can further also be related to the things these people were named after, like Torbjörn being Thor's bear. And another very useful and logical thing that we can learn is number three, family ties and social networks. So because stones often mention who carved them, who commissioned them, and who is being commemorated, you can link specific runestones with other runestones. Sometimes you can see that one person commissioned more than one stone for more than one person to be commemorated, or that one person is commemorated by different people. And because these runestones often mentions the specific family relation, you can construct entire family trees based on just a few runestones that are found in an area. So for example, I showed two runestones in my previous video, go watch that if you want to, which mentioned Gunvald raising one stone to his son and one to his stepson. And then sometimes there's older runestones in which this Gunvald might have been someone's son. So in that way you can see who is connected to whom. And this not always includes family members, sometimes this is also friends, sometimes it's a wife raising a stone to her husband or vice versa. And yeah, this just shows how these people were interconnected. What is interesting about these family ties is that this is not only visible from the content of the runestone itself, from the inscription, but also where the names are placed. Because sometimes you have like one snake in which the runes are carved, and Andrén argues in his article that one snake with all the names inside suggests one family, and if more than one family is mentioned, you have two snakes. And sometimes there's a name placed outside of the snake, and that generally symbolizes the carver, because he or she sometimes wasn't part of this family. And this brings me to number four, which is power structures, and especially also gender and class that we can see. What is very interesting is that actually a lot of runestones were commissioned by women, and this is Also, mostly because a lot of women were the first ones to voluntarily convert to Christianity, and runestones are, for the most part, Christian monuments. And this shows that women not only had enough money to commission a monument like that, but also had, the agency and the possibility to put their own name on it. And there's also stones raised in memory of women. So this shows that some rich women had a strong social position in the Viking Age and were able to raise a stone. And not only a stone, but sometimes also a bigger monument that the stone was kind of symbolic of. And when it comes to like class differences, you can also see the position of rune carvers, which for some was kind of their job, and sometimes they are placed, like I said, outside of the general snake on the stone, but sometimes they're placed inside of it. And this also shows, like, depending on where the name of the rune carver is found, how was this person integrated into the family that commissioned their work. I mentioned that most runestones were Christian, and this brings me to number 5, religion. The runestones can tell us a lot about religion, and now it is generally assumed that the Christian runestones have the majority, especially in Sweden. And this doesn't necessarily mean that this is because Christianity was so strong already so early. Quite the opposite. Because Christian religion and pagan religion coexisted for a long time, people who converted to Christianity perhaps did not have the social support and wealth to raise a church. So instead of building a church, which rich families later did when Christianity became the norm, they raised a runestone to symbolize that they are Christian and they are a Christian family. And many runestones also contain a cross. But non-Christian runestones also exist, and the ones that are Christian, so most of them, also contain a lot of pagan elements, like this snake in which the runes are written. It is thought that this snake can be the world serpent. So runestones are like the perfect example of a religious landscape in transition. Another interesting thing that can be seen on runestones is number 6, historical events. Sometimes the runic inscription refers to a specific thing that happened, and this is why runestones are a very valuable source, and also a mix between a written and a material source, because yes, they have an inscription which contains text, but also they are an archaeological object. And one thing that is mentioned on a lot of stones, which gives us a lot of context onto what exactly happened. There's a group of stones called the Ingvar stones, and they talk about an expedition to the east with a chieftain called Ingvar, and many of the people who went there died, so it wasn't really successful. But there are so many stones mentioning this that there's a lot of reason to think that this is a thing that happened. And this brings me to number 7, which is voyages to the east and west. So obviously, one of the things people think about when they think about the Viking Age is travels to the west, to England, to France, to Iceland, Faroe Islands, Greenland, America. But another very important part is also travels to the east, to Ukraine, Greece, what was then Byzantium, and also Jerusalem. And many stones mention this, because not all of them are raised in memory of people who died. Sometimes they're raised to commemorate a journey that people went on. For example, there are ones who mention people going on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which is a bit different than Viking voyages, but still relevant. But there's also ones who mention people who traveled to England, or people who traveled to Gardariki, which is the Rus, which is modern Ukraine, or to Mikligard, which was Constantinople, modern day Istanbul. So it gives us specific place names that people traveled to during the Viking Age. So arrived at number 8 already is language and writing. So of course, runestones provide an excellent source for linguistic research, seeing how words were written and spelled, and for example, seeing regional differences, stones from Sweden being different than stones from Norway and Denmark. And through studying the evolution of runestones, you can see evolutions in script, in how things were written, in how certain sounds were transcribed into characters. And I was listening to a podcast with Henrik Williams, a runologist from the University of Uppsala, and he said that some basic words like raised, carved, stone were spelled in so many different ways because having the first two letters already suggested, aha, this is probably what is going to be written there. And then there are other specific words like place names and personal names that are spelled in a very specific way because that is how they are spelled. And I guess this also shows not only language but attitudes to language. And another very interesting part of that is number 9, connections to poetry and mythological stories, because some runestones actually have inscriptions that have been connected to either skaldic poetry or mythological stories, like the Karlevi runestone on Öland in Sweden, which contains a verse in Drattkveid, which is a form of skaldic poetry that is also found in other written sources, but not in full on runestones. And there's also the Gotlandic picture stones, which are a bit different, but their comic book outline has been interpreted as poetry, meaning different stanzas and verses. And the images that these stones contain also have been linked to other written down stories from Norse mythology. And there's also some stones which are more clearly linked to mythology, like the Ramsund stone, which contains the story of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. And finally, my 10th point about what we can learn from runestones is how they were used. Now, of course, this is just an interpretation, but some researchers like Anders Andrén imply that runestones are not carved to like be a one-off thing. It's carved and done. No, some people think that they were raised to be read, and not just to be read in silence, to be read aloud, to have people think about the inscription and what is there. Some contain riddles, and a lot of them are placed in quite central places, or places that used to be central, like on a crossroads, meaning that people would see this stone and stop and wonder about what is written there, who it commemorates, who made it. And it's kind of in a way that people still put statues with little inscriptions in public spaces for people to see the statue and read the text and wonder what it's about and who it commemorates. So yeah, that was everything I had to say for today. I know it has been a lot. If you somehow managed to watch until the end, please comment something so that I know that you have watched the entire video, and I will be very thankful for this. I know this has been a long one, but thank you for sticking with me this entire time, and I will see you next week. Bye bye.